Well, folks, we are living in a time that I would never expect that we would see in the United States of America. And I mean that. I know we often talk about persecution in the world and in the country and in the way things are going, but truly there are certain things taking place in America today that I would never have expected to see in my lifetime. And that is the fact that the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ is being persecuted for the faith, and it seems to be growing more and more as time goes on. And I know we've talked about the persecuted church around the world many times on this program, and we've even dealt with the fact that one of these days persecution might come to America. Well, I want to submit to you today, ladies and gentlemen, that we are in the midst of persecution even as I speak. You may not realize that, you may not see that, but we are there. And so throughout the rest of the program, Brother Dave and I are going to be talking about the persecuted church in America. Now, you might ask the question, where is the church being persecuted in America today? Well, Matt Staver of the Liberty Council, who we've had on this program in the past, has recently written an article entitled, "Where in the World is This Happening?" That's the title of the article. Where in the world is this happening? And keep in mind that Matt Staver is the founder of Liberty Council. And I want to read it in length, and then Brother Dave and I will discuss it. So listen carefully. And by the way, I got this particular article out of the Sword of the Lord newspaper. And this is what Matt says. Churchgoers lose jobs because they attend a certain church. Pastors are arrested. Churches are threatened with being bulldozed. Singing in church is prohibited, and home churches are banned. Can you guess in which country this is happening? If I describe for you the conditions of churches in our country where only government-authorized churches are allowed to open, in-home Bible studies and fellowships are banned, pastors are arrested for preaching, churchgoers lose their jobs for attending a church service, police block the entrances to church buildings, churches approved to meet must display a badge on their building, and churches are threatened with being bulldozed for having more than 10 people in attendance. You would probably think that I was discussing some communist, militant, Islamic, or anti-God country. Well, Matt Staver says, all these things can and do happen every day to persecuted Christians and religious minorities around the world, and the things I described above are happening right now in one or more of our legal cases right here in America. Matt Staver goes on to say, Liberty Council currently has 5 federal lawsuits filed on behalf of churches in Maine, Virginia, Kentucky, Illinois, and California. In Maine, churches must apply to the state government for permission to operate. Only churches granted a state-issued badge of approval are allowed to operate, and the badge must be displayed on the outside of the building. In Virginia, a pastor was arrested for having just 6 people more than allowed by the governor's illogical 10-person order at a Palm Sunday church service. Police officers remain stationed in the church parking lot to warn prospective attendees away. In Kentucky, 14 people were put on mandatory 14-day quarantine, the equivalent of house arrest, for simply attending a drive-in, stay-in-your-own-car Easter Sunday service. As a result, many of those churchgoers lost their essential service jobs and have been unable to find new work. In Illinois, the state and local governments targeted Romanian immigrant churches, towing cars of neighborhoods around the church to gin up the gate and resentment against the church, using police vehicles to block the church parking lot and even threatening to seize and demolish the church buildings should the church meet with more than 10 people inside. In California, all religious singing and chanting is banned. And in 32 countries, representing 80% of the California population, people cannot worship in church, including a ban on Bible studies or fellowship in their homes. Matt Staver goes on to say, you would think I was talking about repressive countries where such things happen every day, and believers have been driven underground into secret meetings. Yet, these are just a sampling of the unbelievable restrictions and government abuse happening in America. And this does not include the outrageous stories we've heard from approximately 2,000 pastors in 44 states whom we are counseling on navigating their own state and local officials' unconstitutional edicts. And that, of course, is an article written by Matt Staver of the Liberty Council. Some of those things we know about, we've heard about, we've talked about, but putting them together right here enables us to see how serious the situation is. As a matter of fact, before we went on the air here, we were talking about out in Portland, Oregon. We know that a lot is going on out there these days. But at one particular point, Bibles were used to ignite an American flag. And you talk about tearing at the root of this nation. This nation was built on biblical truth. And the flag represents the freedom that we have in this nation. When you burn Bibles and when you burn the flag together in one fire, boy, that has a lot to say about where our country has gone. And so, Dave, you've heard me read that article. What are your thoughts on what I've just read to our people here today?
Well, you know, Brother Gary, if you talk about religious persecution in the United States of America, especially on social media, you'll get a pretty visceral reaction from a certain segment, even of the Christian church, that will say something like this: well, there's no way that what's going on in our country could be described as religious persecution. And then they'll cite examples of persecution in other countries. But, Gary, the fact of the matter is this: though it's not as intense right now in the United States of America as it would be, say, in a Muslim country where Christians are being persecuted for their faith, yet this is the beginning stages of it. All you have to do is understand what's going on in California right now with Dr. John MacArthur, Grace Community Church, and then I think the pastor's name is Don McCoy, who is the pastor of another very large church there in Southern California. Both of those men have been threatened with $1,000 a day fines for merely preaching, holding public services. And, of course, if you cited, and Matt cited in his article, Governor Gavin Newsom has said there's to be no singing, there's to be none of these kind of things taking place. When in the United States of America have we ever seen anything like what we're watching right now, especially understanding that we have a First Amendment that puts no restriction whatsoever? In fact, the words are there can be no abridging, no limiting in any way of our freedom of speech, our freedom to peaceably assemble. And yet through this COVID-19 situation, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily, it's been Democratic governors and mayors that have instituted these egregious, out-of-bounds, unconstitutional mandates. And so, Gary, it is the beginning of a very, what could be, apart from God intervening, a very intense time of persecution in the United States.
Well, it is the beginning, and here in the United States, we would have never thought that churches would be persecuted or even go through what they're going through right now. And we know that this has been on the increase over the past several months since we've been going through this COVID-19 situation. And we know that these situations are real. They're taking place all across the country. My question to you, Dave, is where did this whole attitude begin on our home turf, where churches should be restricted from just operating, from just functioning? I mean, what is the beginning and the growth and the development of that here in the country? Where did it come from, do you think?
Well, Gary, I think that this kind of attitude that is now surfacing has been suppressed and under the surface, so to speak, for a long time. But with the election of Donald Trump as president, he has been the most faith-friendly, religious liberty supporting, Israel supporting president that we have had perhaps in the history of the United States, at least in modern history. Let me put it that way. And eclipsing even in many ways the great, Ronald Wilson Reagan. So I think with the election of this president, not only were the forces of evil and the enemies of America and the enemies of God's church, the enemies of truth, not only were they inspired and unified in their attempt to try to stop him, but I think what they saw him supporting is something that they are diametrically opposed to, and that is the expression of our faith and the living out of our faith. And so I think really, Gary, what's gotten all of this started is the fact that Donald Trump was elected president, and they're pulling out every stop There is no holds barred as to what they're going to do to try to stop him and stop the policies and the principles upon which he stands and those things that he's trying to advance. And I think at the forefront of all of that is religious liberty. The president chose as vice president Mike Pence, a man of deep Christian faith, and around these two men as advisors to them are a plethora of incredibly committed Christians, maybe more so, again, than any administration, certainly in modern history, if not the entirety of the United States of America. So many Christians part of this administration. They're not perfect people, but they do understand religious liberty, and they're supporting it. So, Gary, I think that's where all of this has come from, and I think that's why there's so much venom being directed at the president and the church right now.